Okay. So we are continuing the series looking at the Lord's Church. We've started looking at the work of the church. And last week we began looking at the work of benevolence. Recall I had said we memorize the work of the church with the acronym B for benevolence, E for evangelism, E for edification. Um, and so we looked at benevolence to start with, and we had noted that it was limited benevolence that we see in the scriptures. Not that individual Christians can't help any need that they see, but so far as the instruction given to the church, that it is limited to those who are members of the body of Christ.
And limited in the sense of the scope of who it applies to, not in like stingy.
Right. Yes.
Right, yeah.
Yes. And in fact, we see the word liberality used with
Yes.
regard to the nature of their giving, and they're giving with a view to ministering to other saints. And so giving should be liberal, but limited insofar as the scope. And we talked about the fact that it is the collection for the saints. It's actually right in the phrase that's used on a few different occasions in Scripture that there is a limitation built into it. And so we've looked at a number of examples out of the book of Acts. We were in Acts 2 and Acts 4, Acts 11. And I think we also looked at Acts 6 along the way. Maybe we looked at a little in chapter 5 as well. But there's a number of places in the book of Acts where we see benevolent care. And so we'll jump out of the book of Acts. This week we'll get into the book of Romans. And Romans chapter 15 is where we're headed. Romans 15 verses 25 and 26. And so again, just for the sake of our class, remember what we're looking for is what's the source of the funds that are under discussion here, but then also who is the recipient of the funds that are under discussion here. And so in verse 25, Paul says, "But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem." So just to set this in its proper time frame for us, remember when Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and in fact, we'll look at a couple of those texts in just a few moments, but in both 1 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians, we've got Paul writing to the Corinthians talking about the need that's down in Judea, and that prepare a gift to send to them, and if you choose that I should go, then I'll go. That's in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 4. Well, Paul is on his way. That's what verse 25 here is telling us, is that I'm going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints because it pleased those in Macedonia. 2 Corinthians in chapter 8, Paul was telling the Corinthians, the Macedonians are really giving, right? He was trying to urge the Corinthians to give as they ought and prepare as they should. And he used Macedonia as an illustration of that before Paul shows up in Corinth. And so it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia. Well, what's Achaia?
A region?
Yeah, guess what one of the major cities in it is? Corinth. And so Achaia is Corinth, right? And so it pleased, Paul, we want you to go with the gift as well. And so this letter's written in that time frame. All right, so the source of the funds that were being given here, it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints who are in Jerusalem. He doesn't outright say it pleased the Christians of Macedonia and Achaia, although I think that it's inferred that that's what he's talking about. But certainly the recipient, first of all, at the end of verse 25, I'm going to minister to the saints. And then 26, a contribution for the poor among the saints who are at Jerusalem. And so again, the context limits the scope of who is receiving benevolent care. Now, so far as the famine that was going on and the needs stretched far beyond just the Christians. That was We would understand that to be the case. So the famine was not something that was only felt by the Christians. But the church does not have, and I think we ended our class last week by talking about this. The church does not have, first of all, the mandate to be able to minister to those beyond the church. If we do have that, then we ought to, but we would have to find it in Scripture. We don't just get to make it up as we go along. But then I would also suggest that the church doesn't have the ability to do so. That if the church were to put all of its resources into any and every need that comes along, the church would have no resources ever. There are sufficient needs in the world, and even limit that back to just our communities. There are sufficient needs that we would be in the red all the time. There would just be no way to not be. If the ideal was, hey, we minister to every need and any need, which again is the typical perspective that people seem to have in the world about churches, that this is sort of what churches are for. We're the oddball out on this in many respects. And I think this was mentioned last week because we actually look for a pattern in Scripture and we seek to follow the pattern. So the saints were the ones who received it. The saints were the ones who gave it. 1 Corinthians. Let's go on over to 1 Corinthians and chapter 16. We had mentioned this a few moments ago. 1 Corinthians 16, the first 4 verses. It says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me." Well, verse 4, we know from what we just read in Romans 15, it was fitting. They wanted Paul to go, and so Paul went. But we looked at this verse, or these verses 1 and 2 specifically, when we were talking about the worship of the church and various elements of the worship of the church, as we seek to come together and worship God and encourage one another and so forth. And giving was one of those elements that are involved in our worship. And we had noted that he tells them, verse 2, on the first day of the week. Well, that's the day that they were coming together. The first day of the week was the day that the Christians assembled. Not that they very well could have, but Paul didn't prescribe any other day. He prescribed the first day of the week. And so we follow that by way of example. And so far as this being, some will argue this is just about a particular need that exists and only that. And I can see where some could come with that argument. My question then would be, well, what about day-to-day expenses associated with the work of the church, with evangelistic work, with if the church needs to rent a place in order to meet, if the church is supporting evangelists. In Philippi, they sent time and again to minister to Paul's needs, supporting Paul. If they only ever took up collections when there was a tragic event that took place, then where would the funds for those other things that are going on come from, right? Because the collection would just be about the tragic events. I believe what we see is an ongoing pattern that the Christians were giving on the first day of the week, that there are a number of things that would be authorized for the collection for the saints to be used for. And we talked about that back in those classes when we were talking about worship. All right, all of that now will come back to this. And there is a specific need in mind as he is writing it. And so the source of the funds is the Christians who are at Corinth. They're the ones who are giving. And Paul says, I gave the same order to the churches of Galatia. As we find out, he also gave the same orders to the churches at Macedonia. And so they are the source. And then verse 1 tells us the recipient. It is the collection for the saints. And then we find even more specifically that it is to Jerusalem where this gift is going. And so, again, I would set this verse alongside the several others we've looked at that would tell us there is limited benevolence so far as what the church is to do. Yes.
What is the assertion that we use the on the first day of the week, let each of you lay something aside as a binding example? But how can we be sure that it's a binding example and that Paul isn't just saying that because, well, he knows that's when they all are definitely going to be together. So it's a matter of convenience. He isn't saying per se, you couldn't on a Tuesday.
Right.
I know you're all going to be together on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that, right?
Right.
And then we're saying to people, oh, Tuesday, you gave on a Tuesday, shouldn't have done that. Are we being too strict in that regard?
Okay, good question. So the first thing that I would point out is that without this statement, then we are sort of at that point where, when do we do it? Do we do it?
Right.
There's then no instruction specifically for the taking of a collection, at least not here. I guess we still have some examples of that in the book of Acts and so forth, and some references to it being done in other places. Here it's given as a command, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. And so he's not just talking about an example of things that are taking place. He's not just talking about an inference that something has taken place. He actually is giving a command in the text. I have given orders, and you must do also. And so what is the command? Is the first day of the week part of the command at that point? And so most Bibles would have a semicolon after the word also, and then he says, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up so you may prosper. Now, is the command just simply set something aside, or is the first day of the week part of the command? Then becomes the question. I read it as that being part of the command, that it comes through that way. Now, I do think there is a matter of convenience involved in it, that Paul already knows this is the day when Christians are meeting together, that the Christians are in Acts chapter 20 meeting together on the first day of the week to break bread. Interesting contrast between the two texts. Acts 20 verse 7 is not a command. It's an example, right? We've got an example of the church gathering in order to break bread. We've got an example of the church giving on the first day, or not example, excuse me, a command of the church giving on the first day of the week. And so if we take the first day of the week out of the command, do we also take it away from the example? And then when do we partake of the Lord's Supper? We would have nothing that says when we should do that. And so I would always tend to err on the side of caution, in that if a text specifically has said something, and we could see how, well, that could be for convenience sake, maybe that he would say that, but then there's other things that work around it which indicate, well, that makes a whole lot of sense, then that would be the day. And now I know there are a lot of religious groups that would not like this idea, and they want to pass the plate on Tuesday, and they want to pass the plate on Wednesday, and they want to pass the plate every time that their door is open. And it would seem that that's not the intent in the Lord's church. That the New Testament church is not a money hungry organization. It's just simply, hey, there's some good to do. Let's do it, but we need to be sure that we've collected the funds in order to do it. So, does that make some sense?
Yes.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't going to disagree.
Oh, right. Yes. So, wasn't sure if I caught all the points of the question.
Yeah. No, I know that is as someone could on.
Right. Yeah.
With that, saying, no, you're making too much out of this.
Yep. Yeah. I would rather err on the side of caution, and it is command. It reads as command. It's just whether is the first day portion of it command or not. I would read it as command, just the wording of it. I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. Oh, Paul, what must we do? On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside. That seems to be part and parcel of the command.
Mhm.
So, yeah. All right. 2 Corinthians and chapter 8. So he had to say a little bit more to that about the need to this gift that was to be sent. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and we will start at verse 1. We're going to read the first 5 verses. It says, "Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, and yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering of the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God." All right, so those who are giving in the context, the churches of Macedonia, and so Philippi would be in that, Thessalonica would be in that. There's a few others that would be in that region. Excuse me, no, not Thessalonica. Yeah, Thessalonica. It's in Philippi, or it's in Macedonia. So there's a few different churches that would be involved in that, and so he's bragging on them to the Corinthians. These ones are doing big work over there, and not that they're a bunch of rich folk. He says out of their deep poverty they're giving, and in fact we thought they were giving too much, but they're giving, and we implore you to give as well.
And we see that in the book of Philippians, because Paul mentions how often they sent to him while he was in prison.
Yes.
And he, I think, specifically mentions there as well that you folks aren't like rolling in dough here.
Yeah.
Obviously worded in a much more Paul way of putting it.
Right, yes. They those Philippians, they do a lot of good, and they're not really wealthy individuals to be doing all that good. But in verse 5, Paul keys in on why they're doing this. They not only as we hoped, they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. So their commitment is to the Lord, and if their commitment is to the Lord, then they're concerned about God's people. And so, we have family members who are starving. Well, we should feed our family members who are starving if we're able to do that. And so that's what they're doing here. So the source of the funds are the churches of Macedonia, and the funds are going to the saints. It's for the fellowship of the ministering to the saints down at verse 4. And so again, it falls into that pattern that we've seen out of Acts, out of Romans, out of 1 Corinthians. There is this ongoing pattern of who the recipients are. One chapter over, so into chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians. And again, we're going to start at verse 1. So 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and starting at verse 1. "Now concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you, for I know you your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. Yet I have sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this respect, that, as I said, you may be ready, lest if some Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, and we, not to mention you, should be ashamed of this confident boasting. Therefore I thought it necessary to exhort brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. All right, so I find this interesting. In chapter 8, Paul is saying to the Corinthians, hey, I want to urge you to be giving as much as you can because the Macedonians, they're giving even beyond their ability to give. And then here in chapter 9, we've been bragging about you to the Macedonians about how much the folks over there in Achaia, the Corinthians, are on board with giving and ministering to this. And that spurred on the Macedonians. And so he's encouraging both groups by talking about the other group and their intentions to give. Now, Paul's concern, however, with Corinth, he already knows the giving nature of Philippi, right? Because Philippi has helped him out on a few different occasions in his preaching. When Paul was in Corinth, remember they didn't pay him at all. They didn't minister to him while he was there. He didn't receive anything, any kind of monetary or otherwise support from them while he was working there. And so I suspect there may have been a little bit of concern about, okay, is Corinth going to be stingy, or is Corinth going to step up to the plate and actually involve themselves in the ministering to the saints here? And so I find the contrast of chapter 8, chapter 9 to be interesting. But so far as the source here, he's writing to the church at Corinth and encouraging them to give. And then verse 1 concerning the ministering to the saints. So again, we have that limited scope being addressed in the text. And it's specifically the saints who are in Judea that he would be talking about. All right, so that's the Corinthians. Over to First Timothy. And so we've got another text, First Timothy and chapter 5, and we will start at verse 3. First Timothy chapter 5 and starting at verse 3. Rather lengthy text this time, 3 down to verse 16. 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning at verse 3. He says, honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. For this is good and acceptable before God. Now, she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. And then verse 17, we'll just add in 17. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. Now, there is a whole bunch in this text. We're not going to go through the text verse by verse or note every little thing in the text. We could do that on another occasion. We're going to be changing the format of our Wednesday night class to if you got a topic, a text, that kind of thing, then let me know beforehand, and that's what we'll study on any given week. And so, if anyone wants to do a deep dive into First Timothy chapter 5, we can do that on that occasion. Here, we specifically want to look at it with regard to the benevolent work of the church, and so he is dealing with providing for needs. I think that's evident from the text when he says widows who are really widows. He describes that later on what one who is really a widow is, and so over the age of 6, and a few other things that he describes there. And so, what he's qualifying that for is the church will take care of these ones who are widows over this age, and meet these kind of stipulations. But if there's a younger widow, he urges her to carry on with your life. Go ahead and get married again, and have children and so forth. And the intent here is not to say that if a younger widow who is a member of the church, maybe she's just been widowed and she's going through difficult times because she doesn't have the resources anymore now that her husband is gone. Paul's point is not that the church should not step up and minister to the needs that she has. His point here is that is not going to be an ongoing thing. Down at verse 15, 16, let's see. It talks about them being taken into the number. And so, 16 is that the church may relieve those who are really widows.
In verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number.
Okay, 9, yes, thank you. So taken into the number. Well, she's already in the number of widows, right? Because she's a widow. And so when he says taken into the number, he's basically saying taken into the number of those that the church is going to be providing for. And so remember back in Acts chapter 6, we had the Hellenistic widows who were being neglected in the daily distribution, right? And so essentially, and things are a little different because there's only the one church at that point, and these are people from all over the place and all kinds of needs going on. But those who were being ministered to on a daily basis were in the number, if you will. There was some kind of organization, and the apostles wanted the organization to get a little bit better organized. And by organization, I don't mean outside organization. I mean the preparation. And so, but it was just understood. We're going to minister to these people because they have needs. Same thing among the widows, but again, the qualifications that are stipulated there. And so widows can receive, if they are truly widows or really widows, as the text speaks about, basically ongoing support from the church. And so if they may not have any means themselves, they may not have any family in order to take care of their needs, and so the church would then have that responsibility. But in verse 16, he says, if any believing man or woman has widows, I guess she's got some family members, step up, family. And he talked about that earlier in the text as well, that honor those who are really widows. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. Take care of your family. And he was really blunt in verse 8 when he talked about that. If you don't provide for your own, especially those in your own household, you've denied the faith and you're worse than an unbeliever. And so he's hammering on the fact that if you have family members, then you have responsibility to those family members. And it's not the church responsibility to step in and, the church is going to provide for everybody. That's not the work of the church. Mm-hmm. But when there is someone who is in need and there is no one to provide for them, then the church ought to step in. And verse 17, this isn't benevolence, but let me just bring this up from verse 17. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. Most commentators would say this double honor that's talked about there is that, first of all, the honor of being an elder, so respect, but then the double honor would be that they would also receive pay. And so that's why he says, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine, that they're actually doing part of the evangelistic work on a larger scale, if you will. And so there would be maybe compensation for them in doing so. But he's dealing with the church's money and the church's responsibility for that. And verse 16, again, if anyone has widows, let them relieve them. Look at the latter part of it, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. We need to be cautious about that, to not just look for occasions to, well, the church can pay for that. Yeah. That might be true. But if there's other circumstances that can come into play, then he says, explore those circumstances. If that means that, some family needs to step up, then family needs to step up. If that's a younger widow, then, she gets remarried and pursues further life with a new husband and so forth. But I find it interesting that Paul uses that kind of terminology. Do not let church be burdened. Don't look at the collection for the saints as just simply, well, it's just the pot that we all get to dig into. It has been set aside for the purpose of ministering to true, legitimate, and difficult needs, and then other parts of the work of the church with evangelistic work, edification, and so forth. So. All right. Anything else on any of those texts? Again, there's a lot of other things inside of 1 Timothy that we're not going to look at this evening, but we could look at those another time if we wanted to. Some additional texts, we're not going to actually look at them tonight, but just I'll mention them. We did look at Acts 6 last week, so it's on my additional text list. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, James chapter 2, all of those also address the idea of benevolence as well. All right, so it's important to also distinguish between what the church can do and individuals can do. And it's not a distinction maybe that is always seen in the religious world. A lot of times there's sort of some mix and match, and well, if you're a Christian, you can do it, the church can do it as well, and that's just simply not the case. And I think we understand that in regard to some things. I can run a business if I want to. I can run any kind of business that I choose to, so long as it's not some kind of sinful activity. The church has no right to run a business. That's just not what the church is here for. I can go and play sports. If I want to go play volleyball or something like that, I can go play volleyball. A bunch of us can go play volleyball. But the church can't go play volleyball. That's not part of the work of the church. And so, I say we understand these distinctions. There's some in the religious world who don't see distinctions there, but I think there are distinctions to be understood between what a Christian can do and what a church can do, because it's not always the same. And that is the case with benevolence as well. And so the church is made up of Christians, I get that, but the church has a limited function and scope that Christians do not have. And so churches can minister to the needs of Christians. We've just looked at a whole bunch of verses that say that is the case, that churches can minister to the needs of Christians. And yet there was that caution that we saw that the church be not burdened. So we need to be careful about the way that we use the Lord's money. Not every need that exists among Christians is necessarily suitable to be addressed by the church. And so that's something that we could pursue further if we need to on another occasion. Individuals can also minister to the needs of Christians. If you know somebody who's a Christian who has needs, you don't have to run to the church and say, brother so-and-so's got a need. We need to go minister to that. That might be the path to pursue, or we might just simply go buy a box of groceries and drop it off at brother so-and-so's house and minister to the need ourselves. And so Christians, individual Christians, can minister to the needs of other Christians. And so there's a number of texts that would indicate that that's the case. Matthew 25, Galatians 6, James chapter 1, and so forth. Individual Christians can minister to the needs of non-Christians. And so if my neighbor who is not a Christian has needs, if let's say that there's somebody in the community and their house burned down. Well, they've lost everything in that case. And so hopefully they didn't lose any lives, but they don't have anywhere to stay. They don't have any clothes anymore. They don't have any food. All the things that were in their house are gone. I can help out. I have the ability to do so, and so I can help out, whether it be that I pull out some things that I'm not using and donate them to them, or give some money, or whatever it be. As an individual Christian, I have the ability and the right to minister to their needs. And Galatians 6 and at verse 10, let's go ahead and look at what Paul writes there. Galatians chapter 6 and at verse 10. Paul says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith." So the latter part of that verse, especially to those who are the household of faith, well, obviously that's Christians. And so I can help out Christians. The middle portion of it, let us do good to all. Well, the inference would be that he's talking about those who are not Christians in that case. Otherwise, it's not a distinction to be made. And so that is the difference that he's establishing here. And so it is good for us to do good to our brethren. It is good for us to do good to those who are not our brethren. Just a few words of caution applicable to those three areas: the church as a body helping Christians, we as individuals helping Christians, we as individuals helping non-Christians. First of all, we can't minister beyond our ability. And so, don't put ourselves in need in the process of ministering to somebody else. And so if in providing food for somebody, we end up not having food for a week, that was not a wise choice. God does not expect us to do beyond what we are capable of doing. We can't minister to every need, so we may be able to find other avenues that are going to minister to people's needs as well. It'd be great if we could minister to every need that comes along, but we may not always be able to. And so we might need to do some assessment of importance and severity and those kinds of things as well. Sometimes helping is not helping. We don't want to facilitate irresponsible behavior. And I've had cases where that was so, that helped somebody out for a few months in a row, and they just started to rely upon the fact that I was going to help them out. And then when I offered actual, I have a history in accounting and so forth. If you want, I could help you work on a budget. And they didn't want that at all. Just, give me the food. That's all they wanted. Well, I'm not sure my helping was actually helping.
I think I would say the same thing.
Oh, okay.
In a way or it's similar in the sense that, like, the help may not always be what they're asking for, because in that case, and there are some people who just aren't good with money.
Yeah.
And the help in that case they need, unless they want to be in that same situation, is either spending what they have better, or if they need, find a better job, or find some sort of opportunity there.
Yeah.
And otherwise, it's just like you say, it's going to be that perpetual reliance on on other people.
Yeah. And it's not that that in itself is necessarily wrong. That's the picture that Paul is painting for those who are truly widows.
Right, yeah.
And so they do receive a perpetual amount because their circumstance warrants it. But if somebody is just simply not wanting to improve and like, well, I don't need to because so-and-so is going to bring me food on the second day of every month. Well, they've just created a dependence upon you. And that
And
might
it's not
not be
exactly
healthy.
respectful to that person because they had to work for
Right.
that.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, Paul addresses that. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10, even as when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. Paul was not expecting people to just, somebody trying to mooch off you, you go ahead and let them do that. He actually said the opposite. He said, if they're not willing to actually do the work, you have no responsibility to put food on their table. And, we don't to see people starve, and yet at the same time, if somebody has an ability to do something about it and they're not willing to do it on their own, maybe going without some food for a little while is going to teach them something. I don't know. So, all right. So the church,
Sometimes discomfort isn't a bad thing.
right? It's a good teaching
Right.
tool.
And I'm sure Paul wasn't advocating for letting that man starve. I
Right.
think he knows that after a couple of days, he'd be like, well, this isn't fun. Right. And most likely it's a negative motivator. And it's too bad that sometimes we need that.
Yeah.
But there it is.
Yeah. And then hopefully he comes along, brother, you got any work you need done?
Yeah, right.
So, yeah. Hopefully it turns things around. So, all right. So the church as a body can help needs of Christians. Individual Christian can help needs of Christians. Individual Christian can help the needs of non-Christians. The church cannot help with the need. That is just the way that the Bible is. And again, we've noticed a whole bunch of verses that establish a pattern. And God works with patterns, and we need to follow his pattern.
On the physical needs. The church
Yes.
very much so is helping the non-Christian by enabling the gospel.
Yes.
be preached.
Yes. So with regard to benevolent care,
Right. Yeah.
but with regard to evangelism and even edification, we've got a responsibility to non-Christians in those. But the church as a collective does not have a responsibility, a mandate, or the right to be ministering benevolently to non-Christians. Now, it's commonly thought in the world that that's what churches are here for, right? And even some churches, they will pattern themselves after that model. And I would suggest, remember, we started our class last week talking about the market-driven church. And the model where churches are ministering to the needs of non-Christians actually predates the market-driven church. It was around before that came along, but that just because folks have been doing it doesn't mean that it's what God wants us to be doing. So here's the issue. There is no example, there's no command, there is no indication anywhere in Scripture that the collection for the saints should be used to minister to benevolent needs of non-Christians. That there is just nothing there. Why don't we use instrumental music? Is it not for the very same reason? That there is nothing there that would suggest that we should. And we go back into the history of music in the church in the first couple of centuries, and there are all kinds of quotes from people in those first couple of centuries that verify that what we read in the scriptures is what they were doing. They were not using instruments. Even though the instruments were available, they weren't using them because they understood this was the instruction of the apostles, and there was singing, and that was all. The reasoning behind not ministering to the benevolent needs of non-Christians out of the collection for the saints is exactly the same. There is an absence of any kind of instruction whatsoever. And in the absence of instruction, we don't get to make it up. We don't get to just, decide on our own. Silence is authoritative. When God doesn't say something, then that's authoritative. And you've all likely heard me use The example of the parade square over at RMC. Commanding officer calls them all to attention, and the commanding officer walks away. Well, when he walks away, he's being silent that whole time. He hadn't given another command at all. What do they have the right to do? Stand at attention. That's it. Nothing else. Until the commanding officer comes back and gives another commandment.
Hopefully he didn't forget about it.
Right. Hopefully he didn't forget about them. Went out for coffee. And Nadab and Abihu, they didn't have a command yet. They went ahead and acted without a command. They didn't know what fire they should take from. And rather than wait for God to tell them where they should get the fire from, oh, God didn't say, I guess we'll just go ahead and use this fire. And I don't think they went to the local garbage pit and got fire from there. I don't know what source they used. I suspect that it was something they counted as a respectful source of fire, but it wasn't what God wanted them to use. And so fire came from heaven and devoured the two of them. Why? They violated God's will. They acted where God had been silent. We shouldn't act where God has been silent. So, Jesus did not establish any kind of the church to be a social program or a community food bank or run orphanages or nursing homes or any of those kinds of things. That was not at any point the intent of what he was wanting to do. This text that we've looked at here in Galatians, let's go back to it again for just a moment. Because when you're talking with some folks who want to justify the church using the treasury in order to minister to benevolent needs outside of the church, this is one of the texts that will come up. So again, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith. So, well, why would that not authorize the church to minister to the needs to all? Context is important. So who is he addressing as he's writing this?
The Galatians.
All right, so he's addressing the Galatians, which Galatia is a province. There's a number of churches inside the province of Galatia, all kinds of Christians there. The question is he addressing the work and activities of congregations or the work and activities of individuals?
Here's from the context that it's individuals.
Yes. So back at verse 1, brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For each one shall bear his own load. Let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Where in all of that was there an address to, here is the work of the church?
Wasn't there?
Right. So if we yank this verse away from its context, we can make it mean something, but that's not what it means. He is not saying, all right, church, go ahead and use your money, the collection for the saints, to minister to how to do good to all. That's a misuse of the text. The context is obviously about individual responsibilities before God. And so we have an individual responsibility. All right. James chapter 1. James chapter 1 is another text that will often be brought up to address whether the church is to meet the needs of non-Christians or not. James chapter 1, verse 27. So it says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world.
Well, again, he's talking to individuals. That one's even, I think, more clear
Yeah,
from the context.
yeah,
Especially because he says, oh, a church can't bridle its tongue. A church has no tongue.
right.
If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his own tongue, religion is useless. If you want to call yourself religious, these are the things you've got to do.
Yeah,
So it's an individual responsibility to visit orphans and widows in their trouble.
yes,
And that is actually a little bit concerning in another regard, because a lot of individuals will either not do this, myself included, unfortunately, at times, but will then also say, well, I gave money to the organization that sends people. So orphans and widows are being visited, and that is a good thing in general.
right.
But it's not the intent that James is saying.
Yeah,
It's not give money to an organization that will visit an orphan or widow. It is you do this
yeah,
individually.
yeah. Yeah, and I think a text like this really needs to be set into the historical context that James is talking about. So these orphans and widows, now I'm not going to blanketly say that they are all Christians or family of Christians. I do think that is the primary focus that James has. There, not that there wouldn't be orphans and widows outside of the body of Christ as well. There always have been. But the persecution coming against the church, and we've got Paul and his cronies coming in at times, before he was Paul, Saul of Tarsus and so forth, coming in, carrying off people. And so, maybe the man gets taken and the woman is left, and he might have been put F. And so here she is left with 4 children. Things of that nature were taking place. And so the Christians needed to rally around these orphans and widows and be ministering to them and meeting their needs. And so that certainly would come into play. In the context, he doesn't address it to a church. It is an individual responsibility. And even verse 27, we can see that it's individual to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That's not the church's responsibility to keep me unspotted from the world. That's my responsibility. Everyone in the church ought to be doing that, but that is individual. And everything in this context is individual responsibility. Now, I would not be opposed if the need were sufficient for a church to operate a senior's home, which some people that's shocking, right? What would make the need sufficient? If a local congregation had a number of elderly individuals who have no one to care for them, and they are all members of that local congregation, then there would be maybe a need for that. We're not talking about some big thing like Trillium or that kind of thing. Just maybe somebody's house being used in order to minister to these various saints or so forth. And I think that would be a legitimate thing that a church could do in ministering to their own widows and widowers and so forth. That's a far stretch from the church supporting a senior's home that is just open to anybody and everybody, right? That would not be authorized by Scripture. But all of that said, this still comes down to individual responsibility in James chapter 1. One last text, and we will close out our lesson. Matthew 25. So Matthew 25, and starting at verse 32. Starting at 32. And we'll read for a little bit here. 32, he says, all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. He will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." Then he will also say to those on the left hand, "Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. All right, so there's a whole bunch of different works inside of that text that Jesus talks about, and this is a judgment scene, and so obviously these are important things. And so the question then is, do we as a church have a responsibility? And there's some who would come to this text, maybe even just like they would go to Galatians, although Galatians, I think they presumably have a stronger argument from Galatians until you put it into its context, or the James chapter 1 text. But some will come to this and say, here's a bunch of things that we as a church need to be doing. Are these things that we as a church need to be doing?
It's individuals being judged again. And from the previous parables, that becomes a little more obvious.
Right.
But if the text was for a group to be doing this, it would actually be sovereign governments.
Yes.
and not the church.
Right.
But that's not who's being judged.
Right.
Thank goodness for that, because hardly any of us would be able to stand
Oh
that
boy.
judgment.
Yeah, we'd be in trouble then.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, it's an individual thing that's being addressed here. We don't stand as a group before the Lord in judgment. We stand as individuals, and we have individual responsibility. If these texts that we've talked about, James 1, Galatians 6, Matthew 25, if these were, if we were to try and follow them as, hey, this is what the Lord wants the church to do, not only would we need to have orphanages and nursing homes and soup kitchens and food banks, but we would also need to have hospitals and hostels and thrift stores and prisons.
There are some who advocate for that. Maybe not the last one.
Maybe not the prison, right?
Yeah, maybe not the prison, but all those other ones.
Right, but if it's one, it's all, right?
Mhm.
We can't just pick and choose. Well, the Lord wants me to have a thrift store, and the Lord wants me to have we'll have a food bank, and but we're not going to have a prison or a hospital, right? If this justifies the church doing these things, then it justifies the church doing all of these things. And I would suggest not even justifies. If people are looking at this and saying, if this is authorization for us, well, if it's authorization, then it's also responsibility. If God authorizes us to do something, then we are responsible to go ahead and do that, if we have the capability to do so. But it's all individual stuff. This is not about the church as a collective body. As a collective body, the consistent pattern in Scripture is that in benevolent needs, it is limited. The church can minister to the needs of Christians, local Christians, faraway Christians, but always Christians, and nothing beyond that. And to impose anything on the church beyond that is to put in place something that God did not. And that would seem to be a very bad place to be, to start doing something that God has not authorized us to do, with essentially what is His money, the collection for the saints set aside for the work of the Lord and of His people. All right. Anything else on benevolent care?